Hello everybody, and thank you for coming to my virtual seminar. My name is Dawson Stone and I am a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan. This project is being done under the supervision of Dr. Michelle DeWolf from Mount Royal University and Dr. Camille Parton from the U of S. Our collaborator with the Northwest Territories Geological Survey is Bernadette Knox. So today I'm going to be talking about my project doing bedrock mapping and the lithogeochemistry of mafic volcanic rocks in the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt, Slave Craton, Northwest Territories. The Winter Lake Greenstone Belt is located about 250 kilometers north-northwest of Yellowknife. It's just a bit south of the Nunavut border, and this map just shows where both of them are relative to the city of Saskatoon. So the Slave Craton is known to be highly prospective for VMS mineralization, but most of the exploration has been done either on the Nunavut side of the border or fairly close to Yellowknife, leaving this relatively underexplored gap in the center of the Slave Craton, which formed part of the impetus for doing a project in this location. The Winter Lake Greenstone Belt has been interpreted to have this broadly synformal geometry with eastern and western fold limbs. It has a turbiditic core flanked by these earlier conglomerate sequences, which overlie our volcanics. It generally has a faulted contact with the underlying basement. So our project focuses on the volcanic rocks of this belt, and we looked at them in 5 different transect locations. In 2019, we did a transect south of Big Bear Lake and another one south of Newbigging Lake. And then in 2020, we did one across the 152 showing, one south of Sherpa Lake, and then one further south of Big Bear Lake. The goal of this study is to reconstruct the volcanic environment specifically for the mafic volcanic rocks of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt and to better constrain the location of the VMS mineralization within that volcanic stratigraphy. The level of detail for this research should allow for more definitive conclusions than previous mapping, which was done at 1 to 50,000 scale, and for the subdivision and possibly modification of the already described formations in the area. So moving on to the more small-scale local geology. The volcanic stratigraphy in the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt comprises 4 different volcanic formations. The felsic Mesoarchean Newbigging Formation forms the bottom layer of our stratigraphy. It is overlain by the Credit Formation, which is sort of poorly understood, but structural observations suggest it sits stratigraphically between the Snare Formation and the Newbigging Formation. The Snare Formation is equivalent to the Cam Formation around Yellowknife. It is mainly tholeiitic basalts, and the VMS mineralization in our area is present at the bottom and top of this formation. And then the bimodal Providence Formation is present in the Winter Lake Belt, but was not seen in any of our mapping transects. The Newbigging Formation comprises felsic to intermediate volcanic rocks at the stratigraphic base of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt. It is dominated by quartz biotite plagioclase schist and contains quartz spheric lapellae ash tuffs as well as massive siliceous rhyolites. You can see in the top 2 photos here we have this flow banding in a coherent rhyolite flow, which was overlain by this flank breccia. But then there are these more highly deformed sections that can be gneissic and difficult to differentiate from the basement. So in this bottom photo there seems to be a bit of incipient gneissosity forming, and then over here you can see where it's barely distinguishable from the surrounding granitic gneiss. The Newbigging Formation is uniquely ancient for the Slave Craton. Different parts of this formation have yielded uranium-lead zircon ages between 3.3 and 3.1 billion years old. The Credit Formation overlies the Newbigging Formation. It is composed of heterogeneous high magnesium tholeiitic to komatiitic basalts and their associated volcanoclastic rocks. It also contains highly altered komatiitic flows. It has been metamorphosed to upper green schist and lower amphibolite facies with local tremolite talc schists present. It is volumetrically dominated by volcanoclastic rocks with thin pillowed and massive flows interlayered within. This upper left photo shows a silicified tuff layer overlaid by a darker flow. Here we see some pillowed flows that have altered this darker red color, indicative of being more mafic than the surrounding volcanics. Here we have the spinifex texture of the komatiitic flow, but the pyroxenes have been mostly altered to tremolite at this point. And here we see crenulation cleavages within a ash tuff layer. The snare formation was sort of the main focus of this project. It is composed of homogeneous thick sequences of pillowed and massive basalt flows with a lesser volcaniclastic component. We really only saw these volcaniclastic tuffs in the eastern limb of the belt. They are tholeiitic to calc-alkaline in composition, green schist grade, and relatively undeformed compared to the lower volcanic units. And this is the formation where we have our VMS mineralization. So these two top photos show the typical pillow basalts that form these really thick pillowed flows in the snare formation. Here we see a mafic tuff, and here we have this cool outcrop where you could kind of see the pillows in 3D with these circles at the surface and then the longer tubes visible on the flank of the outcrop. So the methods used are going to be, or were, detailed mapping at 1 to 2000 scale over 5 geological transects, optical microscopy to identify alteration and ore minerals, whole rock lithogeochemistry, radiogenic isotopes, mainly samarium neodymium analysis has also been done, and we will be doing zircon, uranium, lead geochronology as well. Now moving into the current mapping results. So this map was produced based off the transect across the snare formation at the 152 showing. The snare formation is shown here in green with interbedded massive and pillow basalts. The orange shows the location of the two showings, the flip side massive sulfide showing here, and the 152 massive sulfide showing here. The lighter gray up here represents the Itchen Formation, which is composed of metasedimentary turbidite packages. This was a bit of a surprise because we had expected to see the felsic volcanic Newbigging Formation here. It's separated from the snare formation by a thrust fault. There is a nether fault over here, after which we seem to repeat the stratigraphy of the snare formation, moving southeast. It's difficult to tell because of a larger gabbroic intrusion component that enters here, which sort of obscures the volcanic stratigraphy. The trace element geochemistry for the mafic volcanics at the 152 showing was extremely homogeneous. We can see the mafic volcanics shown in green and the later gabbroic intrusions shown in purple. Plot as pretty much a single point within the larger basalt field. On this extended rare earth element spider diagram, we see this pronounced negative niobium anomaly, followed by a slight negative slope through the light rare earth elements, and we are interpreting these two factors to be indicative of either continental input or slab metasomatism. And then on this Pierce diagram, we see that the mafic volcanics are plotted within this arc signature area, while the later gabbroic intrusions have a trace element signature closer to just normal morb mantle. Mapping just south of Big Bear Lake was completed over 2 field seasons. The northern half was done during the 2019 field season, and then the southern half was completed during the 2020 field season. Starting over in the western part, what we see is quite similar to what I just showed at the 152 showing, with the snare formation being comprised of these interlayered massive and pillowed flows, with VMS mineralization closely associated with these reactivated syn-volcanic faults. Moving over this large north-south trending fault scarp, we get into the turbiditic Itchen Formation again. But then going west over another fault scarp, we have the Credit Formation. This is composed of these thick layers of interbedded tuffs with minor silicified iron formation, as well as interlayered massive and pillowed basalt flows. We also have numerous ultramafic intrusions shown in purple, a large one here, and then smaller ones dotted throughout. And there are 2 komatiitic flows that were observed as well, one here and then one a bit further south. Crossing over another fault, we have a repeat of the snare formation. In the field, this chunk was pretty much indistinguishable from what we saw further west, but as we'll see in a moment, the trace element geochemistry does distinguish it from this formation somewhat. And then finally, we have the Itchen Formation also repeated over on the easternmost side of the map. The geochemistry at Big Bear Lake is a bit more varied than what we saw at the 152 showing. The Credit Formation is shown by these purple circles, while the snare is again these green triangles. And then the blue triangles represent that chunk of snare formation that was further east on the map I just showed. All 3 formations plot within the basalt area of this diagram, quite close together. But where we see them being different is on their extended rare earth element spectrograms. So the snare formation is identical to what we saw at the 152 showing. It has this negative niobium anomaly, followed by a slight negative slope through the light rare earth elements. But then when we look at the credit formation in purple, it is very similar but more extreme. It has a more pronounced negative niobium anomaly, followed by a steeper slope through the light rare earth elements. And we are interpreting this to reflect a higher degree of crustal contamination. Looking at that eastern chunk of snare formation, which is shown in blue, it's similar. It has a slightly less pronounced negative niobium anomaly, and then instead of a slightly negative slope through the light rare earth elements, it has a slightly positive slope. So while the two were mineralogically identical, we are interpreting this difference to mean that they were erupted either at slightly different times or somewhat distally from each other along the rift. This Pierce diagram also reflects these differences. We have the credit formation, which here has a more continental arc-like signature compared to the more oceanic signature of the snare formation. So what we seem to have is a trend going from the more continental to a more oceanic morb-like setting. Moving into the eastern part of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt, this is the transect that was completed just south of Newbigging Lake. And what was surprising here were how few volcanics were actually present. So this light green and this darker green represented fine and coarse granite gabbros, while this lighter pink color represents the even later granitic intrusions. And then this dark purple over here is bits of exposed basement gneiss. Where we did see volcanics was in these small preserved slivers throughout the map, completely surrounded by intrusions. These two yellow bits were where we had a rhyolite dome and a banded rhyolite flow, while the lighter beige colors were felsic volcaniclastics. This lighter green color was a preserved bit of mafic volcaniclastic, which may have been a component of the snare which got juxtaposed against Newbigging, or a mafic component of the Newbigging, which has not yet been described. The geochemistry for the Newbigging Lake transect ended up being somewhat limited when compared with the 152 and Big Bear Lake areas, mainly just because there were fewer volcanic rocks for us to sample. But what we do see is our Newbigging samples plotting within the rhyolite area of this Pierce diagram, while our suspected snare samples, shown in blue, and the later Bedrock intrusions, shown by these purple triangles, both plot within the basalt field. When we look at the extended rare earth element spider diagrams, what we see is the Newbigging Formation having the most extreme signature of all of our formations. It has the most prominent negative niobium anomaly, followed by very enriched light rare earth elements with this extreme negative slope through them, which we have interpreted to represent the highest degree of crustal contamination of all the formations. When we look at the snare formation in blue here, it's very similar to what we saw in that eastern block from the Big Bear Lake transect. It has this slight negative niobium anomaly, followed by a very flat signature through the light rare earth elements, and then the purple gabbros are somewhat flat throughout. When we look at this Pierce diagram, we see the Newbigging samples plotting very high up in the continental arc area with very high thorium enrichment, with the snare formation again plotting down in the oceanic arc area with a lower thorium enrichment, showing a similar transition as before, but missing the higher snare and credit formation here. So the Sherpa Lake transect was again in the eastern part of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt, but a bit further south than the Newbigging transect was. And here we saw a lot of the volcanic units that were missing from further north. So starting in the northwest part of this map, we had the conglomerates of the Sherpa Formation, which had this heavily faulted contact with the snare formation to the west. The snare formation was composed of these interlayered, massive, and pillowed basalts, and was much more deformed and more heavily intruded by these later gabbros than where we saw it in the western part of the belt. It also contained more of the sulfide mineralization, but here they did not seem to be associated with any observable syn-volcanic faulting. Crossing over this fault scarp, we get into some more mafic tuffs as well as the Newbigging Formation, which here comprised this very small outcrop of rhyolite and then much more of this highly deformed felsic tuff, which was very difficult to differentiate from the older basement in this area. And then in the southeast, there was this large granitic pluton, which was much younger than the rest of the rocks in the area. The mafic volcanics of the snare formation were more spread out through the basalt field at Sherpa Lake than they were at the 152 showing and the Big Bear Lake transect further west in the belt, but plotted in fairly similar locations. Our two Newbigging samples plotted as expected within the rhyolite area of this Pierce diagram. When we look at the extended rare earth element diagram for these formations, we see the Newbigging behaving as it did at the Newbigging Lake transect, having elevated light rare earth elements with this extreme negative slope through them, and with the very pronounced negative niobium anomaly. We again see the snare formation being split into these two components, one with a more pronounced negative niobium anomaly and a negative slope through the light rare earth elements, and the other with a less pronounced anomaly and a more flat, slightly positive slope. The Newbigging Formation and the blue component of the snare formation plot as they did before at the Big Bear Lake transect. The green component of the snare formation plots similarly, but with a slightly more elevated thorium content compared to what we saw further west. And this could indicate that it is from a separate eruption with a bit more crustal contamination. So for some preliminary interpretations of the current progress. So one of the goals of this project was to see if the volcanic rocks of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt support the synclinal interpretation of this belt. And given current observations, I would say the answer to this is no, they do not. The felsic volcanic Newbigging Formation is present only in the eastern part of the belt. Where we looked for it in the west, what we found instead were the metaturbidites of the Itchen Formation, seen here with sedimentary layering, as well as in a garnet gneiss, which would not be present in felsic volcanics. The Credit Formation was the reverse of this. It was present only within the western part of the belt, and where we mapped in the east, it was not observed. There were also differences in the snare formation between the two sides of the belt. In the western part, we had these very large, very well-preserved pillows with very clear way up indicators. And in the east, we instead had these much smaller, much more deformed pillows. The geochemistry in the east also showed a higher crustal component, and the relationship between the two snare components was spatially identical on both sides. The west and east parts of the snare remained the west and east regardless of which side you were on, which is not consistent with a syncline. So a series of thrust fault panels may better explain the observed structures rather than a large syncline. Sulfide mineralization was present in all of the transects that we completed except for the one at Newbigging Lake. It is always associated with the snare formation and generally is present at the base and the top. It seems to be associated with syn-volcanic faulting where we are able to identify that faulting. The mineralogy is mostly pyrite, generally skeletal grains, but chalcopyrite and pyrrhotite were also present at the 152 and flip side showings. Trace element geochemistry across the snare formation was extremely homogeneous, which made it difficult to pick out the stratigraphic horizons where the ore formation was. So more geochemical work looking at alteration indices will be used to try to better pinpoint its location within the stratigraphy. So for the tectonic evolution of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt, what we see when we put all of our geochemistry from all of the formations onto one extended rare earth element spidergram is this pretty clear trend from the Newbigging Formation, which is our oldest unit, into the snare formation, which is the youngest unit, of less pronounced negative niobium anomalies, as well as slopes to the light rare earth elements that go from extremely negative to slightly positive, which we are interpreting to mean either less crustal contamination through time or less slab metasomatism through time. When we put the same data onto a Pierce diagram, we see a very similar trend. We have the Newbigging being this very continent-like setting, which then transitions into a more oceanic morb-like setting as we get into the snare formation. The elevated thorium of the Credit Formation combined with the komatiitic flows that are present there seem to indicate that plume-induced rifting is a more likely scenario in this situation. So our working model is that the Newbigging was present as part of a Mesoarchean continent. Plume-initiated rifting resulted in the eruption of the Credit Formation. As rifting progressed, it became more like a normal morb-like setting as an ocean basin opened, and that is where we had the snare formation in place. So to summarize, the observed structures and stratigraphy of the Winter Lake Greenstone Belt are better explained as a series of thrust fault panels rather than a large syncline. The VMS mineralization in this belt is strongly associated with the Snare Formation and seems to occur at two different stratigraphic locations, both strongly associated with syn-volcanic faulting. The VMS mineralization, along with the geochemistry, indicates an enriched mantle source with variable crustal contamination in an evolving rift environment. This is likely either a continental arc or a plume-initiated rift on a continental margin. The Credit Formation's geochemistry, along with its komatiitic flows and more pronounced contamination and lack of VMS mineralization, seem to strongly indicate a plume-initiated rifting rather than subduction. Funding for this project was provided by the Northwest Territories Geological Survey and by an NSERC grant held jointly between the University of Saskatchewan, Mount Royal University, and the GNWT. Funding was also provided by CanNor Strategic Investments in Northern Economic Development, the Polar Continental Shelf Program, and Northern Scientific Training Program. I would like to thank Beth, Melissa, Leo, and Christian for their excellent field assistance, and also Valentin, Shelby, and Victor for their geological insights in the field. Thank you.